There's a movie I really enjoy, which has a line in it which I always remind people. We make suggestions, he makes decisions. Now, it's spoken in Moneyball about Brad Pitt's character, who's the GM of the Oakland A's. And if you haven't seen the movie, it's well worth a watch. But why am I bringing it up now? Why, on a topic where I've already got people writing me going, are you going to write a book on this? Give me a chance. I'm getting through all the book lists I've already got going on. Let me get through bigger book 2 and maybe a couple of smaller books, and then maybe if I've got funding behind me, I'll look at doing a book on this one. But there's a reason why Nicholas Rogers' huge books and Andy Boyd's huge books have waited till a point in their career where they are fairly firm. They have fairly firm economics behind them, and they're able to basically subsidize their research while they go out and do a big gamble. And these things all interconnect. Because infrastructure is a gamble. In the live, discussing this, there was a whole debate about, well, if you invest in a country which is your colony or your dominion, and they don't act with you in a future event, you've wasted your money. True. But if you don't invest in them, and then they can't act with you when you need them in a future event, then you've wasted even more money, because you're still probably going to have to protect them because they're yours. You have no choice but to gamble. You have no choice but to make a decision. And I think one of the problems that comes through in a lot of this discussion and a lot of the stuff about infrastructure in the shipyards and the colonies, and the Commonwealth and the Empire and all that stuff, is that there are a lot of suggestions going on. There are a lot of discussions going on. There's not a lot of decisions. Prior to World War I, a lot of people are prepared to make a decision. Post-World War I, there is we'll never have a war like this again, because, who would want to? Which, again, I'm going to sound very repetitive, but as I've said many times before, that's presuming your experience of the war is the same as everyone else's experience of the war. Even amongst European countries, the most devastated European country, as a rule, other than France, is probably Germany, that comes out of the war devastated. Yes, Russia descends into civil war, which is far worse than World War I was, and is far more terrible for them, leaving that to one side. But Germany is wrecked by World War I. Then there's the Treaty of Versailles, all the infrastructure. And they come out of that not with a desire to avoid war, but by 1930s, a desire to get revenge, to reclaim the glories they've lost, the status they've lost in that humbling defeat. Italy came out of it aggrieved they didn't get enough given to them in the spoils of victory. Japan came out of it thinking they'd won a glorious war and they were the other side of the world and it was just amazing. But they don't get treated with the status they deserve now. They are one of the great powers in the world. France, Britain, horrified by war, scarred by war. They're the winners. America, it goes both isolationist and scarred, but also at the same point kind of bellicose, depending on the other side of the Pacific. They don't want to get involved in another European war, but by gum, if it kicked off in the on the other side of the Pacific, they'd be in. Asiatic war, here, because that's now their domain. Surely it's our domain. It can't be Japan's domain. Yes, they live there, but not their domain. It's ours. And that's World War I. When you're talking about infrastructure and construction throughout the period of her empire, you're talking something which goes back a very long way. The Royal Navy had established the Antigua Dockyard at English Harbour in 1728. It had been used by the Royal Navy since 1671 as a place for shelter and maintenance. They established Bermuda is first set up in 1795 as an imperial fortress, and Jamaica 1675. It would have a yard there till 1905. Canada, well, there's Eskimo Royal Navy Dock. That's pretty much going there from 1865, and it's set up when the Royal Navy relocated its headquarters from Valparaiso, Chile, to Eskimo Harbor. They still have a strong link with Valparaiso, Chile, so, that's there to help, but they moved their headquarters from Chile to Eskimo, Canada. They established Halifax in 1759. There's a huge defensive fortification there. Ceylon, they started putting things in 1813. Hong Kong, 1859. Well, the Madras Dockyard and the Bombay Dockyard were 1796 and 1811. Singapore really starts to be established in 1938. It's a young un amongst naval dockyards. Weihai Wei, that's far earlier. That had been established in 1898, which is why I find it quite so interesting when I bring it up as part of the Royal Navy's Far Eastern plans. People go, but why were they using Weihai Wei? Well, they've been operating there by the time of they're making these plans in the 1920s for nearly 130 years. They know the area very well, thank you very much. They're fairly certain they can take it with troops and they can secure it and then operate from there. Malta had been used since 1800. The Royal Dockyard will only close in 1959. Majorca, they were using that from 1708 till roughly 1802 when they ceded it back to Spain. And, well, Gibraltar was 1704. Australia, 1859 is when they have a base set up. And it's in the 1880s that they start to really develop Cockatoo Island Dockyard, which was originally operated by the government of New South Wales. 1913, His Majesty's Naval Yard, Garden Island, was handed over to the Royal Australian Navy. It's there to this day. Devonport Dockyard was built in 1892, and since 1913 is the principal base of the Royal New Zealand Navy, or New Zealand Division, or the Royal Navy in New Zealand. They've also had things at Ascension Island and in Aden, and of course South Africa. Britain inherited the Dutch East India Company's dockyards in Cape Town and Simonstown when they took them over, and Simonstown has been part of the Royal Navy for a long time. They were even planning something even bigger than that when they were thinking about a global spanning free fleet operation, where they'd have 3 battle fleets they could wander around the world and combine where they needed. One would be based in the Mediterranean, one in the Indian Ocean, and one in the home. But, they have facilities down in South Africa for the home fleet to meet up with the Indian Ocean fleet if necessary, etc. All these things to go on, just in case you need to meet up down in South Africa to deal with some major power. Can't think what you'd be dealing with that would require 2/3 of your fleet to form up in South Africa. Probably something in South America, but so infrastructure is built around the world. They have coaling stations. They transitioned oil stations. That takes a sort of long time. Prior to that, they'd had watering stations. Something you don't hear much about, but yes, there were spaces where the water was good. Okay, not all fresh water is equally fresh. And if you know in a good area produces good fresh water that you want to be able to get access to for your ships to keep your crews going, because they need water and probably other stores as well, you find it. In the Age of Sail, factories, as sometimes they're called, were around the world. They were centres of trade, but also of stores for your ships and water. This is Cockatoo Island. It's a critical facility for Australia. When I say critical facility, it's where they build two cruisers, where they can build their largest ships, where they'll build tribal-class destroyers, where they will build many of the complicated vessels they build in their period. River-class frigates. Everything that matters will be built in Cockatoo Island, and yet still it's run for roughly 90 years, 80 years, 1912 to 1990. So 78 years, if we're being honest, and built 30 ships in that time. Between 1912 and 1990, it built 30 ships. And you'll notice, hang on, the Royal New Zealand Navy has been started its stuff 1913, but also in 1913, at the same time, the Royal Australian Navy is actually formed. We start seeing nascent things which will lead to the Royal New Zealand Navy. This is when Australasia is getting a lot of support from Britain to develop itself. Why? Because the Royal Navy knows its main fleet is this side of the world, facing off as a German threat, and it needs to secure the Far East. And yes, Japan is a worthy ally. But the British Empire at this point is run by people who believe in trust but verify, and they are prepared to take a decision. And New Zealand stepping up and procuring a battle cruiser, the Royal Australian Navy actually having a battle cruiser, New Zealand one being operated by the Royal Navy on their behalf, the Royal Australian Navy actually having a battle cruiser is part of this. Having the facilities to support those ships matters. And believe it or not, whether you can dry dock and sufficiently repair a battle cruiser is neither here nor there. You have no chance of being able to do with anything that complicated if you don't have a significant shipbuilding and fabrication facility going, which is why Cockatoo Island matters. You can have fuel, you can have all the spare parts you want, but if you don't have the skilled people to install those parts and take the other things out, even if it's not being dry docked, just being done alongside, you're going to be in trouble. You need those capabilities. Australia needs the capabilities. Otherwise, they don't have strategic independence. And you need to keep a flow of construction going. It's one of the reasons why the Royal Navy is constantly ordering cruisers in the 1920s and 30s and interwar years. It keeps yards going. Why do they keep ordering a flow of destroyers? It keeps yards going. Penny packets of sloops, motor torpedo boats, or landing craft keep yards going. You're providing them a baseline income that is not really affected by the economy. Civilian orders will depend on whether the civilian companies are earning enough money or not. But a government can usually get quite cheap loans because they usually have very good credit and they're going to be around forever. That's the assumption of people loaning the money. So they can usually afford to keep these things going. But you have to decide to do so. And the Australian government doesn't. So Adelaide and her sister, these two Town class, pre-World War One town class cruisers are the largest ships built in Cockatoo Island and built for the Royal Australian Navy prior to, well, the end of, well after World War Two in Australia. Everything else bigger than them is built in, hello Britain. Why? Well, one of the arguments put forward is it's far more expensive to build in Australia than it is to build in Britain. Yes, it is cheaper to build in Britain. We have an ongoing production line. Thank you very much. But that doesn't help your industry, that doesn't help your strategic autonomy, and that doesn't help the maintenance and refit of your ships. But if you decide to do that, that means you have to make some decisions which might or may or may not be popular. Will you build as many cruisers as you want? Who knows? Will you have to actually invest in infrastructure? Probably. Will you have to find a way to find that money from somewhere? Either raising taxes, diverting funds from somewhere else if you decide you don't want to raise taxes, or getting running up debt. There are these options. Honestly, infrastructure debt tends to be a sensible way to go because it will pay for itself long term. Even if it's naval infrastructure, it pays for itself. Why? Because if you're trying to develop your steel industry and you're trying to develop your own shipbuilding skills domestically so they can become viable and can compete with the going concerns of major conglomerates on a local level, then if you provide a boost in capability of your industry by employing people to build for your military, those skills tend to transfer into the civilian market and get used for civilian productions. But also, the same companies which are supplying steel for your ships and components for your ships will have enough money coming through. They're going to be good at their job and selling these things because they have to meet your standards. That will then endear them to others. And there is an advantage to building local, especially if you're an Australian firm. If you buy it from the UK, you're probably buying it sight unseen. Or if it's seen by anyone, it's seen by a representative you've hired. Lloyd's Register used to love that. They get paid basically a finder's fee. And they would do very well, but that meant the company didn't get to pick and choose its ship itself. It was spending a lot of money without being able to see what it was getting. This is a pre-internet world, remember? Yes, pictures can be sent by snail mail, but by the time the picture arrives with you, it's probably a few weeks after they've been taken. That's probably too late for you to change anything you don't like. Unless they go back and take it all apart again. Adelaide is a good ship. Adelaide is a good light cruiser. For the Australians and many of these powers, the Dominions, there are certain bench points which are good ships for them to be getting into a practice of building. Light cruisers. Relatively status units because they are a cruiser, but they don't tend to require the armor industry that a heavy cruiser or anything larger would. So it's easier for your steel industry to deal with and manufacture, especially if they have to produce almost bespoke small amounts. Destroyers, they're good, but remember they do require high-speed turbines. And they don't have the space for, or necessarily a space for a four-shaft arrangement like a cruiser can. So that can get speed through power of multiple turbines and multiple boiler sets. Destroyers don't have that space. And sloops, which of course don't count against the treaties and can be used to escort things. These are the 3 points really in this period that a navy and a government which is seeking strategic autonomy and to grow its ability to build ships and to grow its strategic autonomy and its defense and security should probably be focusing on and trying to build them domestically. Interesting enough, prior to World War One, Australia is building all of them. Post World War One, when the legacy of Gallipoli, etc., are supposed to have left a bad taste in Australia's mouth, and when they are looking at the UK's Far East defence plans and are wondering if the UK is really going to secure them, they aren't. They aren't building those things. They build free tribal class destroyers. Let's think about how big Australia is. Yes, you could make the case that that's their infrastructure limit. And it probably is by late 1930s. After all, 4 of the 5 yards which they'd originally tried to order 20 ships from had closed down the moment they finished building those ships because there wasn't any consistent orders coming through. Instead of building 20 ships and ordering them in a row, they should probably have just kept building batches of 5 ships. Gone, we'd like 5 sloops, please. Or maybe, if the yards are big enough, we'd like 8 sloops across the 5 yards. So we'll build an escort group. Yay! And just keep building them, or order a flotilla of destroyers. Order a light cruiser. There are options. Light cruiser, Royal Navies, especially once you get the treaties combined. Well, under the Washington Treaty, they're not going to worry about, because remember, there's no cumulative tonnage requirements for cruisers and anything below that. Once it gets to the London Treaty 1930, that's going to be an issue. But if Australia had actually continued building stuff and had been building capability, there is a difference. They might have been separate in the treaty. They might have had their own allocation of tonnage. It might have been a thing that, okay, capital ships, etc., are combined. That's a combined Commonwealth tonnage. But we're going to leave a certain amount of light cruisers, a certain amount of destroyers, and a certain amount of, light cruisers and destroyers that you're going to be allowed a certain percentage of. Let's say you're allowed 60,000 tons of light cruiser, 60,000 tons of heavy cruiser, and 120,000 tons of destroyer. Nah, probably it wouldn't get that much. 60,000 tons of destroyer. Go away. Be happy. It would work. That would give them 40 destroyers as a limitation, or roughly 5 flotillas. That would allow them 6 light cruisers and 6 heavy cruisers. And of course, they could build sloops, as many as they liked. It's an option, but instead what we have is they're building massive fuel dumps. Huge amounts of fuel dumps. Huge amounts of fuel stored all around Australia. This is one oil fuel installation in Darwin alone, which had 70 tons of furnace, 1,000 tons of furnace oil, 58,000 tons of automotive diesel, and 6,000 tons of marine diesel. And that's just one. There are all sorts of installations all around Australia, Singapore, and Ceylon, or Sri Lanka as we call it today. Huge oil depots, which will be used a lot during World War II. Again, it's a logistics reason. Even American forces were using this oil which had been stockpiled, and the reason they were using it was because, okay, yes, America produces a lot of oil, but do we want to bring it all, have tankers taking it all the way across the Pacific to refuel our troops? and use our precious tankers and escorts going on that distance, or well, there's fuel just sitting there, and the tankers can go a much shorter distance, and we can use far less tankers to do it, which frees up tankers for, I don't know, supporting other operations. It's a complicated one, but they go with the infrastructurally sensible one and logistically sensible one. And Australia does receive top-ups mainly from the Middle East throughout the war. Because again, it's easier for them to get stuff from the Middle East to Australia. It's across the Indian Ocean. Which, yes, there are occasionally German, Italian, and Japanese submarines operating there, and occasionally a surface raid or two. But honestly, is a fairly benign operating environment compared to, I don't know, the Arctic convoys. And I say this as someone who actually lost relatives fighting in the Indian Ocean. They had the great misfortune to come across one of the few surface raiders which ended up out there, and they were unescorted. One of the reasons perhaps why I bang on about having enough escorts quite so often is quite how many of my family were lost in World War II because there weren't escorts. And the reason there weren't escorts was because someone in the early 1920s came up with a 10-year rule. And then in 1932, they announced they were officially going to relax it. And it was officially gone. And at which point you'd expect them to start investing in infrastructure and start thinking about convoy escorts and get the sloops from World War One. The Flower class sloops are starting to fall apart. You need to replace those, and they don't. No one thinks about that. It gets to 1937. The third Sea Lord at the time has been yammering on. The Royal Navy's budget in 1934 was over £56 million. Over £56 million. 200,000 pounds. That's fully armed, everything included. Destroyers, 400 to 500,000 pounds. Sloop comes in at half that price. It's a lot of money still. It is a lot of money. But considering the national budget of the United Kingdom, buying an extra 10 a year would be not excessive, but let's say buying 8 a year. Buying half as many as they're buying destroyers a year. And most years they buy roughly 18 destroyers, buy 8 sloops a year. And that's the bigger sloops I'm talking about. It's 1.6 million on a budget. In this budget, they're actually already buying talking about buying 3 sloops. So it's technically an extra million, which is a lot of money. But if you kept building it, you would have been building up your infrastructure. And if Britain had been building 8 and Canada, Australia, India, and South Africa had been building 2 a year each, well, that would have kept their yards in better condition. And it would have meant every year from, let's say, they started in 1924, they could have had 16 sloops entering service. 16 new 1,200-ton, roughly, ships entering service. orientated around not being designed for a speed greater than 20 knots, and being designed to fight submarines. You could have done it. A conservative estimate of those 16 ships entering service every year from 1924 till 1939, and probably would still have some ordered in and enter service in 1940, would give you 16 times 15. No, 16 times 16, sorry. Which is 160, 176. That's quite useful. That's a very useful, if you can start going down to escort groups. Let's say you divide them into 8 ship corvette escort group, 8 ship sloop escort groups. That is a very useful number. It's 22. 22 convoys being able to be escorted. That's 22 convoys where you have the force to go around them. Probably not simultaneously. Probably the maximum they'll be doing simultaneously is 12. Maybe as many as 14. But it makes things viable, and it gives you escort groups based in Australia, escort groups based in India, escort groups based in South Africa, escort groups based in Canada. And again, you really do have them, because you would have had 32 vessels in Canada. Same in all of these nations. It would be useful. And in the UK, you'd have enough. You would have enough. Caribbean. One of the oldest dockyards the Royal Navy has, and let's be honest, Bermuda is pretty much built by the Royal Navy. Why? Because it has a great climate. Because you can actually support and maintain your fleet there. That's useful. That is really useful. Not everything goes their way. It's not exactly the largest space, and you can't really set up much industry. You use a floating dry dock because it both provides it with survivability in terms of any natural events really taking place there, and also it's considered less confrontational with the Americans. But it's critical for your movement. And it lasts as long as it does because it's critical for the movement. India. It's one of those rise and falls. It's a really interesting scenario in that during the mid-19th century and early 19th century and the late 18th century, India is key for the Royal Navy. They provide the teak warships, some of the best Aegis sail fighting ships the Royal Navy will ever get their hands on. Their dreams. But they stop investing. They stop playing the long-term game in investing in the shipyards. And a shipyard which is one of the finest shipyards in the world, bar none, is up there with Chatham, with Portsmouth, with all the Royal Navy's own home dockyards producing warships, doesn't get the investment those dockyards do. So its personnel do not change over into the steam era. They do not get to be part of that evolution. They not get taken with them, which is a massive loss. Yes, a case can be made that an independent Royal Indian Navy, or even a semi-independent Royal Indian Navy part, would have been possibly an issue. That industrializing even a part of India to support ship production, the steel, the various facilities you need to do, could have been a risk in terms of providing a middle class and growing people who have the money and time to do other things. But the thing is, India already has a large middle class. They already have a massive bureaucracy and civil service, which are paid for mostly by the British government to administer it. And it has the tea plantations and all sorts of other things as well, which are providing them with money. You have to remember, India is different and similar but different. It's different as a colonial asset goes because in many ways the British, when they moved in, implanted themselves into the existing structures in India. It wasn't so much a conquest as an acquisition. And it's weird. And it sets up a very weird scenario for India as it goes on. There are brutal repressions, but there's also a lot of buy-in. There has to be. Because the British in India are always an absolute fraction of the people actually there. They don't like the British, but they don't like each other often more. It's not a nice way to run things. And probably some of the problems we have to this day, but I'll leave that to one side. This is one of the most stupid things known to mankind. Not investing in industry and infrastructure in terms of ship manufacture. And it could have been fixed at any point. Honestly, sloops, light cruisers should have been things that India was building. Under the Washington Treaty, it would have been really sensible because in India, which could do these things and which maybe got a development in terms of an air industry as an offshoot of it, and a car industry as an offshoot of it, would be so much better placed to be a vital power in World War II. Vassals aren't helpful when it comes to fighting wars. Allies are helpful. Commonwealth partners are helpful. Vassals, even if they provide huge armies, are a drain because you have to supply everything to them to allow them to operate. It can make you feel big and support your ego, but really, it's a way of putting off making a decision. This is it goes back to what I was saying at the beginning. You can offer suggestions. Everyone can offer suggestions, but a leader has to make a decision. And on India, the British hadn't been making decisions. They've been putting things off, hoping the decision would either be made for them or it would be made easier. Malaya and Singapore, the linchpin of victory, something which is getting millions of pounds in the estimates, millions of pounds donated to it, and yet still, if you want to have real fun, please read the Navy estimates from 1934. There's all sorts of considerations about what's being put into Singapore. £1 million for this, £1 million for that. And yet they don't complete the defences. They don't complete anything. In 1934, one of the opposition, Mr. Hall, makes a quote. One would imagine from the propaganda of the last few months that the Navy has been starved. But during the last 12 years, no less than 662 million has been voted for naval purposes, and no less distinguished a journalist than Mr. Gavin has pointed out in The Observer that since the war, this country, faced as it is with financial stringency, has spent no less than 2,000 million, as they would have said then, 2 billion, as we'd have said, pounds on armaments, and that half that money has gone to Navy. We are told by the press, by politicians, admirals, and the First Lord Admiralty the Navy is nevertheless in such a condition that our safety is in jeopardy. I wonder what amount of money would have been required had there been no naval agreement. What estimates would the First Lord have produced had there been no Washington agreement? How much money would have been required in this year's estimate had there been on London agreement? The Prime Minister was the father of the London Agreement, and if criticism is levelled against it, he must take his fair share, as he's also entitled Mr. Alexander, who was then First Lord, to the credit that is due. My colleagues and I shudder to think that would have been the expenditure called for, had it not been for the agreements which have been in existence during the last 12 years. The Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Carnarvon Boroughs, Mr. Lloyd George, in explaining the savings brought about as a result of the Washington Treaty Agreement, said that we had saved something like 400 million as a result of the scrapping of certain capital ships and a reduction in size. It's strong words. It's strong words, and it's from someone who has an honest objection to defence spending, who thinks that spending money on the Navy is not sensible at this point. He concludes with this statement. From all his long speech. Tracing in my imagination as well as I can probable course of events in the world as steady on the run from disarmament towards so-called armed security, I am satisfied unless the nations of the world strive in every way for greater disarmament, the great powers of the world will in the coming months and years be arming to bursting point. The propaganda conducted in the country during the past few months and the estimates for the services do not assist disarmament, and for those reasons we shall vote against them at every point. He honestly believes the best way to secure peace is to disarm. And he's saying this in 1934. In 5 years' time after this debate, which was on the 12th of March 1934, World War II will be just around the corner. And this is really one of the problems because, honestly, there is a strong vein, and I can understand the logic. If only everyone would disarm, there could be no war. Okay, says pretty much every one of the major powers. You go first. And the trouble is, not every country is the same as you. In 1934, Hitler is there. In 1944, Mussolini has been in power for a decade. In 1934, it will be the fourth, possibly coming up on the fifth year in a row, the Royal Navy will be pointing guns at the Japanese Navy, pointing guns at them in an incident somewhere in the Far East. There are two reasons services can be asking for money. One, they're paranoid. and they just wish to spend money because they're scared of their own shadow. Or two, they're actually paranoid with good reason. I suppose the third one is you can be uncharitable and go there doing it to pad their pockets and feed money to their director buddies in big companies. But that's usually quite easy to suss out because there's nothing that they really should be doing. And they tend to be asking for the completely wrong thing. And before anyone sits there and goes, well, yes, of course they're asking for the wrong thing. They were building capital ships. They should have been building aircraft carriers. In 1934, you don't know what the future's going to be. And I would argue that whilst by the time of developments of naval aviation and aircraft that get spurned into implementation and accelerated with implementation in wartime do make a strong case that a battleship ceases to be the most effective capital ship you can buy. Still the most effective ship-killing weapon you can buy, but not the most effective capital ship you can buy. And if you have a limited budget, you have to pick one or the other. You're going to pick the carrier. In 1934, you can't yet make that case. You probably can't really make that case till about 1942-43. And even then, the capital ships still get some kicking in of things and are still pretty darn useful. People don't complete HMS Vanguard, etc., out of the goodness of their hearts or because they just wish to see a capital ship. There is no admiral who is that obsessed, especially not in the middle of a war. So yeah, this is a legacy. Hull's whole thing is a legacy of World War One and is a legacy of a wish fulfillment in terms of approach to infrastructure, in terms of defense procurement. Because why would you invest in infrastructure for defense if you're not even going to invest in the defense? If you don't want to invest in these things because you don't think it's useful anymore to do so, you think there's no point. You think that the best way to secure peace is to disarm. That's great, but if you really want to secure, if you disarm, then you can't really maintain an empire. Because people don't tend to want to sit in the empire for love and giggles. There are strange things going on in this time. Malta is another good example of strange things. It's got all this infrastructure built into it, thanks to generations of infrastructure built. That made sense prior to World War One. But the moment you have the Gopher bombers and various other systems in World War One, Malta starts to look pretty iffy. And once you have Mussolini achieve power in Italy, you've got to start thinking, hang on, is this going to be a good base to be? Because let's be honest, Italy's now looking a little bit fat boy, fun boy. And so Malta should have really been not abandoned, but surely less invested in the 1920s and 30s than it was. Conversely, Simonstown, well, the big base they've been planning on building there, they stopped building, and they just concentrate on the existing facility. So no, you can't operate a fleet down there. And the South African Navy, and I couldn't return to the sloop topic again, because let's be honest, they could be very useful ships. They can be used as Coast Guard vessels, they can be used for maintaining buoys, they can be used as minesweepers, as oceanography ships. They can do all sorts of things you need ships to do in peacetime, and then in wartime fulfill the sloop escort role. You can really make use of them. And they're not. If they're building ships, they're ordering from the UK. And then they're not building as many as they could. There are some fun things which go on in the world in after World War One. It's a sea change moment, and that's one of the reasons why we teach it so. World War Two is, to be honest, a continuation of that change. But the biggest change is the approach to investment in infrastructure. Governments and politicians change from worrying about tomorrow to focusing on today. It's not Jan tomorrow. Jan tomorrow doesn't get them anything. It's got to be all Jan today. That's how you keep power. That's how you get re-elected. And that's what the veterans demand. It's got to be a home fit for heroes today. And you can understand that. And yes, there is a good logic to it. But you're often doing that at the cost of putting tomorrow at risk. But that's not your problem because you won't be there. New Zealand is another example. So much against them. What they really need to do was concentrate probably on building small ships, because if you consider all that New Zealand has, even though they afford this, they are a small population, they are a small amount of infrastructure. What can they best support? Now, supplying a battle cruiser is a large statement unit, and yes, concentrating on that, probably good. But if that had been the major unit and then their big statement of support to the Royal Navy, and then they concentrated on sloops and small vessels, that would have probably made sense. But no, thanks to treaties, etc., they descend into a cruiser force. And a cruiser force makes sense from the distance in terms of the Pacific. It makes sense in terms of their size. But it doesn't make sense in terms of their ability to support it, because they don't have the same infrastructure base which even Australia has. They've certainly never attempted building anything that complicated. So they actually find themselves in a scenario where really they're not up to the task. And that's because they've not really thought through what they can provide. They are the longest way away from the UK in many respects. Sloops, smaller ships would have been a very useful thing. They could have actually built those. They could have manufactured them themselves. They could have allowed them to provide a multitude of convoy assets and smaller ships. Yes, cruisers are useful. But again, for New Zealand, it almost, how do I put this? Whereas a 6-inch lighter cruiser, if we want to use the later post 1930 designation thanks to a London Treaty, fits with Australia. They could have produced them. If they were invested in infrastructure, they could have built them. They could have had a number of them. For New Zealand, they need a small number of high status units that can cut through, whilst supplying most of their navy should be these smaller, very capable, but no one really going to notice units. That basically things which are worthwhile buying from abroad. And as good as the Leander class cruiser is, I'm not sure that's really worth it for New Zealand in the 1920s and 30s. But this is part of an ongoing scenario in New Zealand, because they always have so many reasons against them for investment in infrastructure, for actually building these things, for actually doing this stuff. They can go, oh, we have a small population. We don't have the industry. We don't have the direct need because there's no direct threat to us because any threat to us has really got to come through our next door neighbor. So, we can rely on Australia to an extent and who's going to actually come to us. All those things are true. But New Zealand is also incredibly valuable. It's incredibly beautiful. It's not a good reason to conquer it, but it's incredibly valuable. It has a lot of resources. It has a very articulate and energetic people who are very fierce warriors. And I say this based on their performances in 2 world wars, not just an impression drawn from watching The Hacker a few times. And trust me, it does get more impressive the closer you are to it actually being performed. And if it's being performed by a group opposite you on a rugby pitch, you really do have the feeling of, oh, sugar. And don't try and do a hacker back. You just don't. If you're English, you just don't have the movement skills, okay? Just don't. Luckily, I didn't, but friends tried. We'll leave that to one side. New Zealand has a lot of potential, but they just don't have the investment and the long-term investment necessary to deliver it. And this comes from Britain. There's only one decent dock, the Calliope dock, and their own government. Their long-term investment is something which New Zealand really lacks in this period. They are, in many ways, a very individual nation. And the realization they're an island does mean the Navy gets funding. It does. But it's almost as if they detach themselves from the funding, because you could argue that what they're funding is something which British governments would like them funding, especially the short-termist interwar governments. Oh, yeah, we love you buying cruisers. We need 70 cruisers. We don't want to pay for them. We can get someone else to pay for them. Yay! Cute. But not necessarily in the best interests of empire or the best interests of New Zealand. In fact, you could argue New Zealand should have been going for a flotilla defense strategy a la Jackie Fisher, so that they provide so that they have some protection and against likely threats to head their way until a British fleet can arrive. And yes, having some cruisers to be part of that fleet and to be a symbol of their involvement, that's a good thing. Okay, if you're going to do, if you're going to go for 6-inch cruisers, Leanders will do. It's probably not what you should be doing status-wise, but I can see it. But really, what should be there is a couple of flotillas of destroyers and some flotillas of sloops to do minesweeping and escort duty and all those things, and provide almost a picket defense and long-range maritime, all those sort of things. And submarines, maybe quite useful. And one of the really interesting things when you're looking around the infrastructure of all these nations, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, submarines don't really feature like you'd expect them to. For many years in the interwar period, the Royal Australian Navy relied on 6 J-class submarines, World War I vintage. Then, in 1927, they got some O-class vessels. Submarines would have been a really useful thing for Australia and New Zealand to have as an offset strategy, if you want to use that phrase from yesterday's discussion, Junicol strategy, or if you just want to be talking about Bastinian defense. And they're not massive, they don't require a huge crew in this period. They are quite complicated to build. So what you require tends to be a smaller yard, but with highly skilled, highly trained people. And that was actually would have been a very sensible thing for New Zealand and Australia to invest in, because they could have afforded that. And it would have kept a local yard profitable because there'd have been a USP. They do submarines, and they allow us to maintain and repair and build submarines. Maybe it wouldn't have been New Zealand having their own yard. Maybe it would have been an Australian one where both New Zealand and Australia procured from. But a yard, if Cockatoo Island had been turned into something which produced sloops and submarines in the interwar years and occasionally destroyers for those two nations, it could have been a really useful infrastructure hub. But it wasn't. You could argue it's because they're all looking out for themselves and just concentrate on their own problems, and you can argue it's because of their desire for peace and they're thinking the world has broken out in peace. The reality is, it's a mixture of everything. What they needed to do as well was keep building small ships, because that would have been something where they could have been really useful. Instead, they concentrate on having a few cruisers. And again, cruisers are useful. The Royal Navy is constantly going, we need 70 cruisers, we need 70 cruisers, we need 70 cruisers to do our job. And again, it's a problem which comes up with various governments. They don't like the idea of 70 cruisers because, that's expensive. It's not the expense that's really the problem. It's the, why are we building 70 cruisers? Because have you seen the number of positions which need to be manned around the world? New Zealand is lovely. Look at it down there. It's very useful. But the thing about convoying from there, I can return you again to the sloop discussion, but the whole thing of infrastructure, if we look at those bases, we're looking at bases which are mostly built by Britain, which it's still relaxing and enjoying thanks to, in the 19th century. Those are bases which have been developed and built in the 19th century. Some, the early 20th century. Singapore is the newest one, 1938. Lots of money invested in it, and they don't finish the job. To try and save money. Oh, that'll do. The enemy of every completed project known to mankind. That'll do. That'll do. These ships, they could be useful. These ports, they could have worth. But most importantly, you have to decide, and this is the problem, you have to decide what you want to defend and whether you can fund it. There are two approaches you can take to strategic and procurement and infrastructure investment. You can start from the position of what you need to do, i.e. what you want to do and what you need to do, and you can start from the position of what you can afford to do. These are two very different positions. But usually, if you start from one, you also have to consider the other. And then you have to consider, well, what of this can I afford to do on this budget? And it's probably not going to be the full amount. And the worst thing you can do, often, is to try and fund everything at a proportion of this amount. because then you don't do anything properly. It's often better to concentrating on doing a fewer things properly, so they are well done, than to spread everything so you do everything badly, because that might allow you to claim you're still doing everything. But when someone calls you a bluff and actually delivers a blow, you won't be able to deal with it, and everything will fold like a pack of cards. Britain spends most of the 19th century building up a world-class infrastructure and strategic infrastructure network around the world. World-class strategic infrastructure around the world. Yeah, I know that's terrible thinking, but a first-class, almost unique in history infrastructure network around the world. They spend roughly the next century living off the laurels of that. Investing in it was supposed to be done on a 6-year cycle. The first one, which is missed, is 1916. Every 6 years, you do another round of investment, roughly. The next one that's missed is 1922. They don't do it in 1928 either. 1934, they start investing in Singapore, but don't really do much. They had plans for 1940. World War II happened. That is a problem. Failing to invest in infrastructure is the quickest way to undermine you. Undermine yourself. It is the quickest way to undermine yourself. It's the best way to undermine yourself. If you want to know when a superpower or the world's primus inter pares, the global power that dictates all the other global powers, what's going to happen, starts to really decline, it's when they can no longer justify investing in infrastructure. The Roman Empire grew so big that they divided it first into 2 and then into 4, with 2 Augustuses and 2 Caesars. And the reason they did that was because it grew too big for one man to communicate with it all, was the point, their view. Which is strange, because one man had run the empire before then. In fact, many single people had run the empire. A few who may not have been men. And a fair number of wives of the men who were supposed to be running the empire ran the empire when those men were off leading their armies fighting off elsewhere. How do they do it? Surely the technology was less advanced when they were running it, as it was earlier in the Roman Empire. Earlier. Did the threats multiply? To an extent, but not really. Did they stop investing in infrastructure? Things started to break down in terms of organization, in terms of force structure. Things which had always been relied on in terms of providing the infrastructure started to break down, because it used to be you'd had a range of officers, of magistrates, of officials who would go out from Rome, principally, around the empire and ensure things got done. But increasingly, as time went on, those things didn't necessarily happen unless someone turned up who had a lot of power to enforce they got done. And the trouble is, some of those people with power decided they would rather rule from the center, which is why you end up with the 4 emperors scenario. Britain doesn't have that. It's lucky that way. But it does start to have the growth of a political class who start to think more and more in terms of counting the pennies, trying to skimp at every moment, trying to get the most of it for them. Not in terms of a selfish reasoning, often, but in terms of serving the interests that they elected themselves to represent. Pushing for ships to be built in British yards rather than pushing the Australian government to go and build in their own yards. It's good for British workers. It's terrible for the Empire and Britain strategically, but it's good for British workers. If you want something good for British workers, build your own ships in their yards. Or get other countries to invest in them, but try and keep your key infrastructure going around the Empire by getting the yards there to build them. Setting up an Indian Navy. It's a risk, but it's a sensible risk. But it's a risk which might make trouble for British workers. It could do. But it also could make profit for British workers. And longer term, more than likely would, because infrastructure investments tend to pay off long term. Investing in railways, investing in roads, investing in ports tends to pay off. Investing in navies, investing in infrastructure which supports navies, in constructing them, then tends to pay off. Because of the wider industry that tends to feed into and support. The technology, the services, all these things provide not only employment but opportunity. But the thing is, that won't be an immediate return. It won't be a return you can shout and holler about at the next election. Infrastructure. It's all long term, and it's all a gamble. And ultimately, it's all a decision. And you could be as likely to be as right as you are wrong with your investments. But the thing is, you actually have to make a decision and actually do some investment. Not write endless reports and get endless commissioned people to give you suggestions. Actually have to make a decision. And accept when you're wrong. All things which take time. And all things which require a maturity in debate. And that's another reason why I have the 1934 debate estimates open next to me while I'm discussing this all. I have them open because of a line which comes from the First Lord of the Admiralty in 1934, Sir Bolton Eyes Monsell. He is a fairly persuasive speaker, and certainly one of the better ministers in the government in the early 1930s, and worthwhile listening to. Now, here is something he puts out. This heresy about battleships has gained a good many adherents recently because, in our up-to-date journalism, orthodoxy is no longer news value. It is only the heterodox who obtain the headlines, as the Honourable Learner Member for East Bristol, Sir S. Cripps, well knows. Besides this, those who, like the First Sea Lord, have supreme responsibility for these things, are not supposed to take part in public debate, and cannot rebut theories that are put forward by people who have no responsibility whatsoever. So it is left to me to try to make the case for the battleship, which I attempt to do so. Actually, it says, I shall attempt to do. Added in the so from force of habit. In our up-to-date journalism, orthodoxy is no longer news value. It is only the heterodox who obtain the headlines, as the Honourable and Learned Member for East Bristol well knows. We like to kid ourselves, to humour ourselves, that the modern issues we have with shock news, clickbait, and all those things is something that's new. It's not. As long as newspapers have depended upon people buying them to make a profit, not just in terms of the actual sales, but in terms of people being willing to put advertisements in them. As long as the news is dependent upon that, shock headlines, heterodox, as the First Lord of the Lord of the Admiralty puts it, has been the order of the day. Because it attracts attention. Because seeing something which goes against the orthodox and going, oh, yes, I agree with that, can make you feel smart. And supporting the orthodox can make you look like, oh, you're just conservative. You're just a sludge. You don't think. And that can go both ways, honestly. I use the word conservative as in the small c, not the big c. That's not. You just don't think about the real world and see what's happening. If we consider our own defense debate, how much of that stuff about uncrewed systems, drones, how much of it is real and how much of it is shock? How many times is the debate couched in carriers are now white elephants, main battle tanks no more, man fighters will never fly again, F-35 is useless, waste of money? They're always keen on those headlines. But how much of that is true? How much of that, once you look at the detail, is the case, or is actually what we're seeing more of a case of this has made war richer and a greater image, a more complex image, a more nuanced image, but these things still have value, they still have worth. Change is the only constant in life. Death and taxes, I'm told, are both potentially avoidable. I'm not quite sure how. My accountant assures me taxes are certainly not. But, you can get there, perhaps. But change, I know for a fact that never goes away. But change doesn't tend to be completely radical. People move from caves to houses. They still like to live in a covered space that they can make warm. That hasn't changed. Infrastructure, well, ships need dry docks. Ships need to be built. Ships tend to be expensive but worth it, because a ship can only be in one place at a time. So you tend to need more than one to be able to do a job properly. And as a rule, the bigger ship is usually slightly better, because the bigger ship has more space for you to change things during its career. A ship will be in service on average 20 to 30 years, and the world will change a lot in that time. That will probably mean you want to add things in, not take things out. Because if you turn every evolution and every upgrade into a debate over what you're going to take out, it will make it 10 times more complicated than if you can just add in the stuff without compromising the capabilities of the ship in the first place. So empty space is actually a premium valuable asset. And future-proofing ships, especially larger ships, is important because they are investments. Ships themselves are infrastructure for other ships. We, of course, like these days to talk about submarines being the be-all and end-all of capabilities. That is true. But submarines have a nemesis. They've had it since World War I. The same nemesis. Aircraft. Aircraft can do a lot of patrolling. They can drop a lot of sonar buoys. And whilst, yes, their actual kill ratio for dropping all those sonar buoys might not be that high, there are a lot of them. And they can keep going. And they can move a lot faster and cover a lot more ground than a submarine can. So if you have a carrier battle group operating in the same area as your submarines, they can make sure enemy aircraft can't hang around, which frees up your submarines for action. Means they have that less of a threat to deal with. And if you have your own submarines in the area, then hopefully enemy submarines will find operating in that area very toxic. So the carrier group and the submarine work together. It's not an either or scenario if you're sensible, it's a using them together scenario. Kind of like that with infrastructure. Right, what we have coming up. Portland class on Tuesday. And this will go out on Saturday, and Sunday will begin the series of 5 problems with. And I always finish these videos with a question, so the question is going to be this. What do you think? No. What, in your opinion, is the most important piece of infrastructure which has not been yet done by your government? Pick national, state, local level, whatever. What piece of infrastructure would you like to see done? What do you think needs to be done to make lives and make the economy better in your area? Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care.